The first thing that comes back to me is the sound, that deep, gut-rattling hum of the Hellcat's engine right before takeoff, the metallic vibration that crawled up through my boots and into my ribs. It wasn't just noise, it was a heartbeat, steady and defiant, drowning out the nerves that every man on that carrier deck tried to hide behind cigarettes and smirks. The Pacific morning was still dark then, a bruised purple sky bleeding into the sea, and the smell of oil, sweat, and salt water hung thick in the air. We'd heard the Japanese were calling our fighters fat cats, mocking the bulky look of the F6F compared to their slick, nimble Zero. They laughed about how slow we were, how clumsy, but they didn't know what those wings could do when pushed by a man who'd seen too many friends go down in smoke. That morning, I wasn't just flying, I was carrying ghosts. When I climbed into that cockpit, I remember thinking about Charlie, my wingman, who'd been shot down 2 weeks before off Truk. He'd burned alive in a dive that nobody could pull him out of, and his last words still echoed in my head, "Make 'em pay, Joe." Every mission since had been a kind of penance, like I was flying for both of us. I could feel the weight of his absence every time I looked over my shoulder and saw empty sky where he used to be. The crew chief slapped the fuselage twice, the signal that all was good, and I gave him a thumbs up. The Hellcat's prop spun into a blur. My heart followed. As the deck officers signaled for launch, I braced myself, and for a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the catapult's violent shove, that jolt forward that pressed my spine into the seat and flung me into the wide, unforgiving blue. The air was clear, too clear. You could see for miles, and somehow that made it worse, because out there, loneliness wasn't a feeling, it was a horizon. The radio crackled with check-ins from the rest of the squadron, a mix of calm voices and static. We climbed in formation, sunlight catching the metal skin of the planes like fire. My hands felt glued to the controls, half from sweat, half from fear. You never admitted fear, but it lived in you like a second pulse. The Japanese had a way of appearing out of nowhere, shadows diving out of the sun, and when they did, everything became instinct, angles, speed, sound. You didn't think, you reacted. That was the only way to stay alive. As we approached the enemy formation, I spotted them first. 5 Zeros, low and fast, sunlight glinting off their wings. They were beautiful machines, I'll give them, graceful, lethal. I could almost imagine the pilots inside smiling, thinking they had the advantage. I leveled my Hellcat, heart pounding, and muttered under my breath, "Let's see who's laughing now." The first burst came from 2 o'clock high, a streak of tracers cutting the air just above my canopy. I rolled hard left, pulling G's that made my vision blur, and looped behind the lead Zero. The Hellcat groaned, metal straining, but she held. The Zero cut right. I followed. I squeezed the trigger, and my 6 50 cal guns tore through the sky, a roar of fire and brass. The first Zero caught flames instantly, spiraling into the ocean below. One down. No time to breathe. The next one came in from behind, bullets raking my tail. I yanked the stick, dove, and climbed again, the world spinning in a dizzy blur of sea and sky. The Hellcat wasn't pretty, but she could take a beating, and I trusted her like I trusted my own hands. The Japanese underestimated that. They thought their planes were gods of the air, but gods fall too when you hit them hard enough. I climbed fast, rolled, and came out on top of the second Zero. Another burst, another kill. The explosion lit up the sky behind me, a flash that burned through the cockpit glass. My fuel gauge danced. My breath came ragged, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my neck. Still 3 left. I was running on fury now. Sometimes I think what kept me going that day wasn't courage. It was anger. Anger that my friends were gone. Anger that every letter I wrote home might be the last. Up there, I wasn't fighting for strategy or orders. I was fighting for faces, for laughter around metal tables, for promises we made when the night was too long. The third Zero dove toward me, guns blazing, and I pulled into the sun, blinding him. When I came out of the glare, he was right where I wanted him. Another squeeze, another scream of the guns, smoke, silence, 2 left. The radio filled with shouts, chaos, and I realized I'd drifted too far from formation. It was just me now, alone in that endless blue. The 4th Zero came in fast, too fast, and for a split second, I thought he had me. Then instinct took over. I cut throttle, let him overshoot, and lined up my shot. The bullets hit, and his plane shattered apart like glass. 1 left, 1 heartbeat. I could almost feel Charlie there beside me, whispering, "Finish it." I found the last Zero circling back, hesitant now. Maybe he'd seen what happened to the others. Maybe he was afraid. But in war, hesitation is death. I dove, closed the gap, and fired until there was nothing left to shoot at. 5 kills. One day. When I landed back on the carrier, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The deck crew cheered, but I barely heard them. I climbed out, looked at the sea, and thought about the faces I'd never see again. Victory felt hollow. Necessary, but hollow. Before I go on, tell me, where are you watching this from? They told me later it was a record that no Hellcat pilot from our squadron had ever taken down that many in a single run. The captain himself came down to shake my hand, grinning like a proud father. But I remember thinking how wrong it felt to smile. 5 planes meant 5 men gone. 5 mothers waiting for letters that would never come. You start to realize that medals are heavy not because of the metal, but because of what they cost. I cleaned my flight goggles that night, still stained from oil and smoke, and watched the sea roll endlessly beneath the moonlight. The carrier creaked and hummed like a living thing, full of weary souls pretending they weren't afraid. In truth, we all were. Nobody talked about it, but it lived in our eyes when the sirens went off at night, or when someone's bunk stayed empty after a mission. The bravado was just armor for the fear that never left. I remember sitting on deck, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt tar, when one of the mechanics sat beside me. He was a quiet kid from Kansas, barely 20. He looked at me like I was some kind of legend now, said he hoped he'd be half as brave when his time came. I didn't know what to say. Brave? I hadn't felt brave at all. I told him the truth, that bravery wasn't what saved me up there. Luck did. Pure, blind luck. Sometimes the difference between a hero and a name carved on a wall is just an inch of metal, a gust of wind, or the way the sun hits your canopy. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he didn't believe me. People like to think there's glory in killing, in victory, but what I saw in those clouds was just chaos and noise. Men trying not to die. That's the part they don't print in the papers. We stayed on station for another week, patrolling the Pacific skies like restless ghosts. The Japanese weren't giving up. Every time we launched, the tension wrapped tighter, like a wire around the heart. I'd stare at the horizon before takeoff and wonder if I'd ever see another sunset from home again. The mail would come through sometime, damp and creased, smelling faintly of salt. Letters from my sister, from a girl I used to see in San Diego before the war. She always wrote about little things, how the bakery on Main Street had reopened, how the kids were collecting tin for the war effort. She made it sound like the world was still soft somewhere, like not everything had turned to iron and fire. I used to read her words slow, savoring them like they were the only proof that peace still existed. But peace was a distant idea out there. You could feel it slipping further away each time another squadron went missing. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the chaplain's voice murmuring over the sound of the waves, reading names during quiet memorials. We'd all stand in silence, hats off, faces hard as stone. Then, the engines would start again the next morning, and the cycle continued, like the ocean, relentless, indifferent. There was no room for grief when you were next in line to fly. The only thing that mattered was the mission. That's what they drilled into us. Focus, precision, control. But no one told us what to do with the guilt when we came back alive, and someone else didn't. I remember one evening, just before sunset, we were ordered to escort bombers over a small atoll. It was supposed to be routine, but routine in war is just another word for unpredictable. The air was calm, golden, and for a moment it felt almost peaceful. The ocean below looked like molten glass. I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, things were finally quiet. Then, out of nowhere, the radar picked up movement. Multiple bogies, fast and climbing. The zeros again. My throat went dry. The calm shattered instantly, replaced by that familiar surge of adrenaline. Every muscle tensed as I slid my oxygen mask into place. Over the radio, voices sharpened, orders barked, and suddenly, we were back in the dance again. The one where every wrong move meant death. That day didn't end like the first. We lost 3 good men, one of them the same mechanic who'd sat beside me on the deck with his coffee. He wasn't supposed to fly yet. He'd volunteered to fill a gunner's seat last minute. His plane never came back. When they told me, I couldn't even look at the sky. It felt like the ocean itself was mocking me, calm and endless, while we kept feeding it our dead. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the length of the carrier until dawn, thinking about how many faces I'd seen vanish into flame, how many laughs had turned to static over the radio. It starts to change you, the way you look at everything, the stars, the sea, even your own reflection. You stop seeing life as something owed to you and start seeing it as something borrowed, fragile, fleeting. That's when I began writing letters of my own. Not to anyone in particular, just words on paper. Apologies to the ones who didn't make it back. Promises to remember their names. I still have them, folded and yellowed, in a box somewhere. Maybe that's all memory really is. A way of keeping the dead close enough so you don't forget what you owe them. If you've ever felt that kind of weight, the kind that comes from surviving what others couldn't, then you'll understand why I keep telling this story. And if you do, maybe consider subscribing. Not for me, but for the memory of the ones who never got to tell theirs. They woke us before dawn again. Red light in the barracks, boots hitting the metal floor, the smell of coffee and jet fuel mixing into something that made your stomach twist. By then, none of us asked what day it was. The calendar didn't matter. The only measure of time out there was how many missions you'd flown and how many men hadn't come back. The mechanics worked in near silence, faces pale under the glare of the floodlights, each one knowing they were tightening bolts that might be twisted into fire by noon. The ocean outside was black and restless, reflecting a sky that looked ready to swallow anything that dared to rise into it. I strapped into my Hellcat again, hands steady, but my heart already pounding like a trapped thing. It was routine, sure, but that word had lost its meaning. Every takeoff could be your last, and every landing felt like a small resurrection. The mission was to intercept a Japanese convoy off the coast of Luzon. Intelligence said they were moving supplies and reinforcements through a narrow channel, guarded by fighters. We were to clear the air for the bombers. That meant we'd be the first ones in, and the first ones shot at. The captain briefed us quickly, his voice clipped, his eyes tired. He didn't waste words on glory. By then, even the officers had stopped pretending that this was about medals or pride. It was survival, nothing else. I remember glancing at the younger pilots, some barely out of high school, and wondering if they really understood what they were about to fly into. They grinned nervously, the way you do when you don't know any better. Takeoff was violent as always. The catapults slammed me forward, and the carrier dropped away beneath me. The ocean spread out below, like a sheet of cold steel. We climbed in formation, 12 Hellcats cutting through low clouds, each one carrying its own silent prayer. The sun hadn't broken yet, and the world was painted in shades of grey, sky and sea blending into one endless void. I remember checking my instruments over and over, pretending it was about precision, when really it was just something to keep my hands from shaking. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. That voice still rings in my head, calm, too calm, like it was announcing the weather. They came down fast, out of the light, zeros, dozens of them, sleek, precise, deadly. The sky turned to chaos in seconds. Tracers, smoke, metal, screaming engines. There's no sound like bullets tearing through air that close. It's like ripping fabric made of thunder. I rolled hard, felt my stomach lurch, dove under a pair of fighters locked in a deadly spiral. My wingman, Parker, shouted over the comms that he had one on his tail. I looked right, caught a flash of sunlight off the Zero chasing him, and without thinking, dove after it. The G's slammed into my chest. My vision narrowed, darkening at the edges. I lined up the shot and fired. A burst of tracers found their mark, and the Zero exploded into a blossom of flame. Parker's voice came back, ragged, relieved. "Thanks, Joe." But even as he said it, I saw another Zero closing in from above. I shouted a warning, but it was too late. A burst of fire tore through his fuselage, and his plane became a falling star. I didn't have time to grieve. You never did. The sky didn't pause for heartbreak. It just kept swallowing. I climbed hard, pulling into a loop, cutting across two more Zeros who were angling for the bombers. I squeezed the trigger until my fingers ached. The guns roared, shells rattling the wings. One Zero caught fire, the other peeled off, trailing smoke. The bomber formation was still intact, for now. I swung around, heart hammering so loud it drowned the engine. The air smelled like cordite and burning oil, thick and metallic. Every sense screamed at once. The flash of sunlight off wings, the vibration through the controls, the voices over the radio breaking apart into static and panic. At one point, I flew through a cloud and came out the other side into pure silence. For 3 seconds, there was nothing. No gunfire, no shouting, just the hum of the engine and the sound of my breath inside the mask. It was almost peaceful, like the war had vanished. Then a shadow cut across my canopy. A Zero was right above me, inverted, close enough that I could see the red circle on his wing. He dropped into a dive. I yanked the stick, rolled over, followed him down. The altimeter spun like a mad thing. We were falling fast, too fast. He tried to pull up first, but he misjudged. The ocean rose to meet him, and the impact was a flash of white spray. I pulled out just in time, the G's wrenching at my arms. the Hellcat groaning like it was alive and angry. When we finally regrouped, there were only 6 of us left. The bombers had dropped their payloads and turned back, the convoy below burning like a floating graveyard. Over the radio, command ordered us to return. I couldn't look down at the wreckage. I'd seen enough. The flight back was quiet, too quiet. You could feel the ghosts in the formation, empty spaces where friends should have been. When we landed, the deck crew looked at us with hollow eyes, counting planes, counting souls. Someone muttered, "Half the squadron's gone." Nobody answered. The silence was heavier than the sea. That night, I sat alone in the maintenance bay, staring at the bullet holes in my Hellcat's wings. There were dozens, some clean through the metal, others jagged like wounds. I ran my fingers over them, thinking how close each one had. It didn't feel like luck anymore. It felt like theft, like I was stealing time from men who deserved it more. The ship's doctor walked by and asked if I was okay. I said yes, but the truth was, I didn't know what okay meant any. Out there, okay just meant you weren't dead yet. Sleep didn't come easier. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Parker's plane fall, heard his last breath over the radio. The sound of metal tearing stayed with me even in dreams. I started writing again this time to his mother. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to someone that their son died for a mission that no one will remember by name? I told her he was brave, that he saved lives, that he didn't suffer. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. Sometimes the truth isn't what people need. It's what they can live with. War teaches you that every victory is built on loss. For every man who comes home, another doesn't. And even when you make it back, some part of you never does. You reach a point where the noise never really stops. Even when you're on the deck, even when the engines are quiet, the echoes stay inside your head like carved out a permanent place. The whine of the propeller becomes the hum of your nerves. The crack of gunfire turns into a heartbeat. After that mission over Luzon, something in me began to change. The war wasn't a story anymore. It was a smell, a sound, a rhythm that wouldn't let me rest. The air on the carrier felt heavier. The nights grew longer. The ocean around us seemed to whisper names I didn't want to hear. Every shadow looked like a falling plane. Every silence felt like the pause before another alarm. We were ordered north toward the Philippines again, escort duty for another wave of bombers. Command said it would be light resistance this time, that the Japanese were retreating. We all wanted to believe that. We wanted to believe anything that made sense of what we'd already done. But I'd learned the hard way that the most dangerous words in war are, "It should be quiet." Quiet is a lie. Quiet means they're waiting for you. The morning we took off, the ocean was like glass, the sun barely rising. The light hit the water in long streaks, golden and calm, beautiful, if you could forget what that calm usually meant. We climbed to altitude, keeping formation. My new wingman was a kid named Harris. He'd just turned 21 2 days before, and I'd helped him celebrate with a tin cup of coffee and a cigarette. He still had that grin of someone who thought he'd live forever. I remember telling him to stay close, no matter what. He nodded, confident, too confident. We flew in silence for nearly half an hour before the radio crackled. The forward scout's voice came through, rough and fast. "Multiple bogies incoming, high and fast, north-northwest." There it was, the lie shattering again. The sky filled with them. At least 20 zeros, maybe more. They came down like knives through silk, clean, coordinated, merciless. I could almost feel the temperature drop when the first tracers streaked past. We broke formation instantly. The air became madness. I dove, leveled, rolled hard right. My guns opened up, a wall of noise and recoil. 1-0 burst into flames, trailing smoke down into the sea. Another came straight at me, head on, and for a second I could see the pilot's face. Young, focused, human. I fired first. His plane vanished in an explosion that rocked me backward. Harris shouted over the radio, "I've got 2 on me!" His voice was sharp with panic. I scanned the sky, saw him banking hard left, 2 zeros glued to his tail. I pushed throttle to full and dove. The G's crushed me into the seat. The ocean spun closer. The horizon tilted. I fired at the first 0, caught its wing, watched it spiral out. The second stayed on Harris. He tried to shake it, but the 0's pilot was good, too good. He matched every move. I lined up another shot, but before I could fire, Harris's plane took a burst to the engine. Fire. Smoke. I yelled for him to bail. He didn't answer. The Hellcat dropped fast, trailing black scars across the sky. I followed until I saw it hit the water, breaking apart in a flash of steam and flame. Then I pulled up hard, throat raw, chest burning. The radio was just static. I wanted to believe he'd made it out, that maybe he'd floated long enough for a rescue boat, but deep down, I knew better. After that, something inside me broke loose. I didn't think, I just hunted. Every zero in the sky became Harris, became Parker, became Charlie. I flew like a man already dead, chasing ghosts through smoke and fire. My guns overheated, my canopy fogged from sweat, but I didn't care. I hit another, then another. The sky was full of falling metal and fire. You don't feel triumph in moments like that. You feel emptiness. It's like you're trying to erase grief by out-killing it. But grief doesn't die that way. It just waits for you on the ground, patient, quiet, ready to crawl back inside you when the adrenaline fades. When the last of the zeros broke off and disappeared into the clouds, I realized my fuel was dangerously low. I turned toward the carrier, alone again. The sea below was scattered with oil slicks and debris, tiny reminders of how fragile everything was. I radioed in, voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. The landing was rough. I nearly skidded off the deck. When they pulled me out of the cockpit, my legs wouldn't hold. My hands still gripped the stick even though the fight was over. The medics said I was in shock. Maybe they were right, but I didn't feel shock. I felt nothing, just hollow space where something used to live. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The ship rocked gently, the stars overhead sharp and cold. I went to the edge of the deck, stared out at the horizon. Somewhere under all that water were pieces of Harris, Parker, Charlie, men who had laughed, joked, smoked, and believed they'd come home. I remember whispering their names to the sea, as if maybe it would remember them when I couldn't anymore. And then I cried. Not the kind of crying that brings relief, but the kind that comes out like breaking glass. Quiet, painful, endless. Nobody saw. Nobody ever did. The next morning, we got new orders, new targets. The war didn't care how tired you were, how broken. It just kept feeding you more sky, more fire. And we kept taking it because we didn't know how to stop. I looked at the empty bunk where Harris's things still sat, a photo of his family, a letter he hadn't finished writing. I folded the letter, put it in my jacket. I told myself I'd send it home. I never did. I didn't know what to say. How do you tell a mother that her boy died believing he was invincible? People like to ask what it felt like, shooting down those planes, surviving when so many didn't. They expect some grand answer, something about courage or destiny. But the truth is, it felt like losing, every time. Because every enemy that went down reminded me of someone who already had. You start to understand that there's no real winning in war, just surviving long enough to feel the weight of it. Tell me something. If you'd been there, if you'd seen your friends vanish one by one, if you'd carried their ghosts every night after, do you think you'd still be the same person when you came home? Or would part of you stay out there in the smoke and silence, waiting for a peace that never came? Comment below and tell me what you think. If you want, just copy and paste this. I think part of us always stays behind. Coming home wasn't what I thought it would be. You spend years dreaming about it. The smell of grass instead of oil, the sound of rain on a roof instead of gunfire, the feel of earth that doesn't sway beneath your feet. And then you get there, and it's all wrong. The silence feels too wide. The air feels too clean. People smile at you like they know what you've been through, but they don't, not really. They see the uniform, the medals, the handshake from the officer, and they call you a hero. But heroes don't wake up drenched in sweat, clutching at sheets like control stick. Heroes don't flinch when a car backfires or stare too long at the horizon because it looks too much like the edge of the world. The truth is, I left the war, but it didn't leave me. It followed me home, quiet, patient, living in the corners of my mind. When I first got off the train, my sister was waiting with tears in her. She ran to me, hugged me so hard it hurt, but all I could think about was how light she felt, how fragile. I hadn't touched anything that soft in years. She said the house hadn't changed, that Mom had kept my room the same. I smiled, but when I walked inside, I couldn't breathe. The walls felt too close, the colours too bright. The ticking of the clock on the mantel sounded like distant artillery. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the cockpit, the world spinning, the sea rising to swallow me whole. People wanted stories. They always do. What was it like? They'd ask, leaning in like kids around a campfire. I told them what they wanted to hear, that it was tough, that we fought hard, that we made it through. I left out the part about the smell of burning flesh, about the way Harris's voice sounded when it cut out, about how sometimes I wish the ocean had taken me too. You learn to hide it, you smile, you nod, you drink your whiskey a little faster than you should. But at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, the memories crawl out like smoke. You can smell the fuel again, hear the engine, feel the weight of the trigger under your finger. You tell yourself it's just a dream, but you know better. It's the past reminding you it still owns a piece of you. I tried to work again, fixing engines, painting fences, anything to keep my hands busy. The noise of tools helped for a while, but every sudden sound pulled me back to the sky. One afternoon, I was working on a car when a hammer dropped to the floor. The clang made my heart jump so hard I nearly blacked out. The guy beside me laughed, said, "You okay, Joe?" I nodded, but I wasn't. My body was still in that hangar, but my mind was over the Pacific, watching the sun flash off wings and metal. That's how it was, day after day, living half in the world, half in the memory. There were nights I'd walk out to the edge of town, where the fields stretched wide and dark. I'd look up at the stars and listen to the wind. Out there, the quiet wasn't so suffocating. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and imagine the hum of the Hellcat's engine beneath me again. I missed it, the feeling of purpose, the rush of control, even the fear. The war had taken everything from me, but it had also given me a reason to keep moving. Peace didn't offer that. Peace was stillness, and stillness meant remembering. I kept in touch with a few of the guys from the squadron, letters mostly, sometimes a phone call when the static on the line didn't drown us out. We didn't talk about the fighting, we talked about fishing, about kids, about cars, but between the lines, we all knew what we were really saying. I remember, I'm still here, are you? One by one, the letters came less often. Life pulled us in different directions, but I never stopped thinking about them. Every year on the anniversary of the day we lost Harris, I'd pour a drink and sit on the porch, looking west. I'd whisper their names again, the same way I had that night on the carrier. It wasn't prayer exactly, it was acknowledgement, a promise kept. The medals stayed in a drawer. I never hung them up. They felt too heavy, like carrying someone else's story. People called it pride. I called it debt, because for every piece of metal I earned, someone else had paid in blood. I didn't want to forget that. Sometimes I wonder if it's strange to miss the war. Not the killing, not the fear, but the clarity. Out there, everything had meaning. Every choice, every second. You didn't have time to wonder who you were. You just acted. Back home, the days blurred. The noise of ordinary life didn't reach the same pitch. You start to feel like a machine that's still running after the job is done, unsure what to do with all that motion inside. I used to watch the sky for hours, following the contrails of commercial planes. They looked so peaceful, so distant, but every time I saw one, part of me tensed, waiting for it to dive. Even now, all these years later, the memories come without warning. A smell, a song, a flash of sunlight, and suddenly I'm back there. I can hear Parker laughing, see Charlie rolling his eyes, feel Harris beside me in the cockpit. The war may have ended, but it never really left. It just changed shape. If you've ever carried something you couldn't explain, something heavy, invisible, that time didn't fix, you know what I mean. The older I got, the more the war slipped between my days like a shadow that wouldn't quite leave. Time does that. It dulls the sharp edges, but never erases the outline. Sometimes I'd be sitting in my chair by the window, sunlight drifting across the floor, and out of nowhere, I'd hear it again. The low hum of the Hellcat's engine, soft but certain, like it was passing overhead just once more. My daughter used to catch me looking up at the sky that way. She'd smile and say, "You still think about it, don't you?" I'd nod, but I never really told her how much. There are things you can't put into words without feeling like you're dragging them back to life. The house grew quieter as the years went on. Friends moved, some passed. My sister was gone by the time I turned 70. I started keeping a small box of old photos on the kitchen table, faces frozen in time, young men with confident eyes, some of them gone before they ever had the chance to grow old. I used to trace their faces with my thumb, as if that could pull them back, just for a second. You think time will make forgetting easier, but it doesn't. It just makes remembering lonelier. Sometimes at night, I'd dream I was flying again, not in combat, just flying, the ocean below me calm, the air steady. In those dreams, the sky was endless, and the sun felt warm on my face. No noise, no fear, just the sound of the engine and the rhythm of the wind. When I woke for a few seconds, I'd forget where I was. I'd reach for the throttle that wasn't there, and then the quiet of the room would come back, and I'd realize the only thing moving was the clock on the wall. That's the hardest part of surviving, the stillness that followed. I started writing again in my later years. Nothing fancy, just pieces of memory on paper. The kind of things you write when you're trying to make sense of a life that never gave you the chance to slow down, look back. I wrote about the ocean, the carrier, the smell of the hangar at dawn. I wrote about Harris and Parker and Charlie. I wrote about how we joked before takeoff, how we pretended not to be scared, how every laugh was really just a way of saying I'm still here. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at the words, like I could still hear their voices in the next room. I guess, in a way, I could. People often asked if I regretted it, going to war, doing what I did. I used to struggle with that question. There's pride in what we fought for, but there's no pride in what it costs. Maybe that's the real truth of it. I don't regret serving, but I regret that it had to be served that way, that the world needed boys to climb into machines and chase death through the sky. We didn't know it then, but we were all just trying to make sense of a broken world with the only tools we had: courage, anger, and hope. And somewhere in all that chaos, we lost pieces of ourselves we never got back. I visit the memorial sometimes. When the weather's clear, I stand there, in the crowd of names, running my hand along the carved letters. Some of those names were mine once, my brothers in the air, my family in the fire. I always bring a small flag, sometimes flowers. I don't say much when I'm there, just a quiet thank you. Because what else can you say to ghosts who gave you the rest of your life? Now, when I see the young ones, kids, barely old enough to shave, talking about flying, about joining, about honor, I smile. But inside, I want to tell them the truth. That bravery isn't about wanting to fight. It's about carrying what happens after. It's about living long enough to remember. And remembering isn't easy. It takes everything you've got. The war may have ended on paper, but in me, it never really did. It just changed its uniform. It became time, memory, silence. Sometimes I think that's what we all become in the end. Our own kind of battlefield, full of stories that never stop echoing. Sometimes, when I think about it now, I realize that the war gave me two lives, the one I lived and the one I never stopped reliving. Every story I've told, every dream I've had, every breath I've taken since those days has been connected somehow to the boy I was up there in that Hellcat. I still remember the smell of oil on my gloves, the way the morning light turned the ocean into a mirror, and the weight of silence that always came after the shooting stopped. There's a strange kind of peace that comes from understanding you've already survived the worst thing that could happen. The rest of life, no matter how uncertain, feels like borrowed time. I used to think that was a curse. Now I see it as a gift. There's a small airfield a few miles from where I live. Sometimes on weekends, the local pilots take their vintage birds out for a spin. You can hear the engines from miles away. Low, throaty, familiar. I'll sit on my porch, coffee in hand, and just listen. Every time I hear that sound, something stirs inside me. It's not fear anymore. It's recognition. A reminder that once, a lifetime ago, I was part of something bigger than myself, something fierce and fragile at the same time. And though it took pieces of me I'll never get back, it also gave me a brotherhood, a sense of purpose, and a story that still means something. I've had people tell me, "You were lucky to make it out," and I suppose I was. But luck feels like too small a word for it. I didn't make it out because I was better, or stronger, or braver. I made it out because the wind turned when it needed to, because a bullet missed by inches, because someone else took a hit meant for me. I carry that with me every day. It humbles you. It teaches you that life isn't owed. It's given, moment by moment. Maybe that's why I still wake up early, just to watch the sunrise. Maybe that's why I take my time with everything. After all that chaos, peace feels sacred, delicate, like it could slip away if you breathe too hard. If you were to walk into my home, you'd see pictures on the wall, my family, my grandkids, a few old squadron photos that I keep framed by the window. Sometimes they ask me what it was like, those days in the Pacific. I tell them pieces of it, but not all. They don't need to carry that weight. I tell them we were young and scared and brave in ways we didn't even understand, that we fought because we had to, not because we wanted to, that we came home different men, and that difference never really left. I tell them that the world they live in now, this world of peace and freedom, was paid for by names they'll never know. And then I tell them the most important part, that remembering isn't about sadness, it's about gratitude. There's a calm that comes with age, a softening around the memories that used to burn. When I think about Charlie, Parker, Harris, I don't see their deaths anymore. I see their smiles, their laughter in the mess hall, the way they slapped my shoulder before takeoff. I see them alive, whole, shining in the sunlight of a morning that never fades. That's how I choose to remember them. That's how I keep them with me. So, if you've listened this far, if you've sat with me through the fire, the fear, the silence, and the years, thank you. Maybe you didn't live it, but you felt it now, in your own way. Maybe that's enough to keep the story alive. The world moves fast, and memories fade quick. But if you can take one thing from mine, let it be never forget the cost of peace, and never stop being grateful for the ordinary days that others never got to see. If this story meant something to you, if you felt even a spark of what those skies were like, leave a like and subscribe. Not for me, but for them. For the boys who never came home, and for the ones who did. carrying them forever in their hearts, because some stories deserve to keep flying.